Ethan Blackwood had everything: power, wealth, control. He's secretly helping the homeless. His world shifts, intrigued. He makes her an offer that changes both their lives forever: love, betrayal, and an unbreakable bond. This is their story. A city of contrasts, the Blackwood Grand Hotel loomed over Manhattan like a silent king, its towering glass windows reflecting the city lights, its lavish interiors a testament to wealth and power. Inside, the elite dined on gold-rimmed plates, sipping champagne that cost more than most people's rent. The air was thick with privilege, laughter, polished but empty. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Blackwood, untouchable, unreadable, and undeniably powerful. Dressed in a tailored black suit, he exuded authority, his presence alone commanding attention. To the outside world, he was the perfect billionaire, ruthless in business, detached in emotions, and utterly uninterested in anything that didn't serve his empire. But beneath the surface, Ethan knew the truth. He wasn't just alone, he was hollow, and then came her. A heart too big for this city. Sophie Carter never cared about riches. She had grown up in a world where kindness meant more than bank balances, where love was measured in small acts rather than extravagant gifts. She worked as an assistant manager at Blackwood Grand, but her real passion lay outside its glass walls. Where Ethan lived among the elite, Sophie lived among the forgotten. And tonight, she had a mission. As soon as her shift ended, Sophie ducked into the employee exit at the back of the hotel, a cloth bag slung over her shoulder. She moved quickly, her heart pounding, as she weaved through the darkened alleys near the hotel's pristine exterior. The world changed in just a few steps, from five-star luxury to cold pavement and cardboard beds. She approached a small group, huddled together near an abandoned storefront. Sophie, an old man, Mr. Jacobs, grinned despite his frail frame. He knelt beside him, pulling out a steaming container of food and handing it over with a smile. "Eat slowly, okay? I made sure to bring something warm tonight." His hands trembled as he took the food. "You're too good to us, sweetheart. What would we do without you?" She squeezed his hand gently, her heart aching at the question. Nearby, a young woman cradled a sleeping child. Sophie slipped a warm blanket over them, whispering a soft promise: "You're not alone, I'll be back." This was her world, a world where love wasn't bought, it was given freely, and she had no idea someone was watching. The ice-cold gaze of a billionaire. From the shadows of the hotel entrance, Ethan Blackwood stood frozen. He had stepped outside to escape the suffocating party inside. But instead of fresh air, he had been met with her. His sharp grey eyes followed her movements, observing the way her hands trembled, not from fear, but from feeling too much. Why? Why would someone with so little give so much? His mind rejected the idea. Kindness had no currency. People only did things when there was something in it for them. That was the law of survival. And yet, she had knelt in the dirt, touched their hands, looked at them as if they were human. Something twisted inside Ethan. Something foreign, discomfort, intrigue, he couldn't tell. He didn't move, not even when the limo pulled up beside him. His body was still, but his mind wasn't. Fire meets ice. The next morning, Sophie had barely stepped into the staff lounge when her name was called over the intercom. "Sophie Carter, report to the CEO's office immediately." Her heart jumped into her throat. The CEO, Ethan Blackwood, never dealt with employees below the senior executive level. What could he possibly want? Her hands were still cold from the night before, as she rode the private elevator up to the top floor. The doors opened, revealing a vast glass-walled office, the city sprawling beneath it. She barely had time to take it in before, close the door. His voice was smooth, but there was something dangerously sharp underneath. Ethan Blackwood sat behind a massive desk, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. His eyes, those cold, calculating grey eyes, pinned her in place. Sophie swallowed hard. but refused to let her nerves show. "You wanted to see me, sir." Ethan leaned forward, fingers steepled. "I saw you last night." A chill ran down her spine. Oh God, he saw. She quickly gathered herself. "I was off duty. You were handing out my hotel's food to homeless people." His voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words pressed into her skin. Sophie lifted her chin. The food was going to be thrown away. Ethan's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, a challenge. "That's not the point." He stood, walking around the desk, stopping a foot away from her. His presence was overwhelming, like a storm you couldn't escape. "Why waste your time on them?" His voice was low, dangerous. "They have nothing to offer you, no power, no money. So, why do you do it?" Sophie's heart pounded, but she didn't step back. "Because they're human." Ethan's eyes flickered, something unreadable flashing across his face before disappearing. Sophie clenched her fists. "Not everything is a transaction, Mr. Blackwood. Some of us help because it's the right thing to do." Silence fell between them, tense, crackling with something neither of them could define. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood had no response. A dangerous fascination. Sophie left the office with her heart still hammering. She had just talked back to the most powerful man in New York. She should be terrified, but instead, she was angry. Who does he think he is? Acting like emotions are a weakness, like helping people is a flaw. Little did she know, behind his office doors, Ethan Blackwood was sitting at his desk, staring at the space where she had stood. Her defiance, her fire, it unsettled him. It fascinated him. And for the first time in a long, long time, Ethan Blackwood wanted more. A battle of wills. Sophie spent the rest of her shift trying to shake off the encounter with Ethan Blackwood. But his words clung to her like an unshakable shadow. "Why waste your time on them? They have nothing to offer you." How could someone be so cold, so blind to the suffering of others? She had faced her share of heartless people, but something about Ethan infuriated her, in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the arrogance, it was the way he looked at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle he didn't even believe should exist. But if he thought she would be intimidated, he was wrong. She refused to let a billionaire with an ice-cold heart shake her. And yet, why couldn't she stop thinking about him either? Ethan's restless obsession. Ethan Blackwood had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize emotions. He didn't dwell on things that didn't serve a purpose. He made decisions based on logic, power, and profit. And yet, he hadn't been able to focus on a single damn thing all day. His mind kept replaying her voice, her fire, the way her eyes burned with defiance when she challenged him. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She didn't shrink under his gaze. And worse, she had made him feel something. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. His chest felt tight, unfamiliar, like something had cracked open. He had to get her out of his system, and there was only one way to do that. A proposal that changes everything. Sophie was finishing up some paperwork at the hotel's front desk when she heard the deep, unmistakable voice behind her. "Miss Carter, my office, now." Her breath caught. Not again. The staff around her stared as Ethan Blackwood himself stood there in his crisp black suit, his piercing grey eyes fixed on her. Heat crept up her neck, but she straightened her spine. "I'm working, now." His voice was quiet, but it held the weight of command. A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. She wanted to tell him to go to hell, but she also wanted to know why he couldn't seem to stay away from her. A dangerous proposition. Ethan's office was as intimidating as the man himself, floor-to-ceiling windows, dark leather, and a view of the city that screamed power. Sophie folded her arms. "If you're here to fire me, marry me." The words crashed into her like a storm. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Had she heard him wrong? Ethan's expression was unreadable, his eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "I need a wife, Sophie." His voice was low, controlled. "And I want you." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Are you insane?" "Quite possibly." His mouth twitched, but his eyes remained serious. Sophie laughed, breathless. "You don't even like me." I don't need to like you, he said smoothly. I need a woman the media will believe I fell for. Someone kind, someone selfless, someone who would make the world believe Ethan Blackwood is capable of love. Her stomach twisted. So this is about your image. Ethan's jaw tightened. My board of directors is pushing for stability. Investors want to see a man they can trust, not just a ruthless businessman. They believe a marriage would be beneficial. Sophie's pulse pounded. And what do I get out of this? Ethan didn't hesitate. $1 million. Silence roared between them. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had struggled her whole life, worked herself to exhaustion, barely made enough to help the people she cared about. $1 million would change everything. But at what cost? She looked at Ethan, the powerful, untouchable man, who had never known struggle, never known what it was like to need something. And yet, in his eyes, for the first time, she saw something that looked a little like need. Not for love, not for companionship, but for hope. Sophie swallowed whole. She should say no. She should walk out of this office and never look back. But instead she whispered, "How long?" Ethan's expression shifted ever so slightly. 1 year. Sophie exhaled shakily. 1 year as Ethan Blackwood's wife. 1 year pretending to love a man she barely understood. 1 year trying not to fall for him. A deal with the devil. Sophie didn't know if she had lost her mind. A 1 year marriage to Ethan Blackwood. A billionaire who didn't believe in love. A man who could freeze the world with a single look. But when she thought about what that $1 million could do, paying off her brother's hospital bills, helping the homeless shelters she worked with, securing a future for herself, she knew she couldn't walk away. So she had agreed. And now she was sitting in a private, dimly lit restaurant, across from Ethan Blackwood, as he slid a diamond ring onto her finger. A ring that cost more than everything she had ever owned combined. She swallowed hard as the cool metal settled against her skin, a silent shackle binding her to the most dangerous man she had ever met. Now it's official, Ethan murmured, his voice low, smooth, as silk but sharp as glass. The ring was stunning, but all Sophie could feel was the weight of the lie it represented. Rules of the game. The contract had been simple. 1. Publicly they would be a devoted couple. 2. Privately their lives would remain separate. 3. No questions, no emotions, no real attachment. It sounded easy, until Ethan looked at her like that. Until she started feeling things she wasn't supposed to feel. First glimpses of something more. The media storm hit fast and hard. Headlines exploded with the news of Ethan Blackwood's engagement to a mysterious hotel employee. Who is Sophie Carter? They asked. From humble beginnings to billionaire's bride, reporters swarmed the streets. Paparazzi camped outside her tiny apartment. She couldn't even go to work without hearing whispers. But the hardest part wasn't the public, it was him. Ethan played the role of the devoted fiancé too well. His touch lingered too long. His words felt too real. His eyes burned through her defenses. One night, after an extravagant charity gala, he leaned down to whisper in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Smile, Sophie. They're watching." She forced herself to ignore the shiver that ran down her spine. But she couldn't ignore the way her heart betrayed her. The night everything changed. A week into their engagement, Ethan took Sophie to a lavish weekend retreat, a breathtaking glass villa overlooking the ocean. "We need to make this convincing," he had said. But nothing about the moment felt fake when Sophie found herself dancing with him under the moonlight, barefoot on the balcony. A slow song played in the background, but the real music was in the way he looked at her. For the first time, his guard was down. For the first time, Sophie saw a man who wasn't just a ruthless billionaire, but someone who had been alone for too long. And before she could stop herself, she whispered, "What happened to you, Ethan?" His body stiffened, his fingers, which had been resting gently on her waist, tensed. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it, he said, "I stopped believing in love a long time ago." The confession was like a crack in his armor, and against all reason, Sophie wanted to step closer. But Ethan wasn't ready for that. Instead he let go of her hand, turning away. "Go to bed, Sophie." And just like that, the moment was gone. A line blurred. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Ethan's words, the way his voice had sounded almost broken. She was falling into dangerous territory. This wasn't supposed to be real. She wasn't supposed to want more. But what if she already did? And worse, what if Ethan did too? Because the next morning, when she stepped into the sunlit kitchen, still in her silk nightgown, she found Ethan standing by the coffee machine. And when he turned to look at her, something shifted in the air. His gaze dropped to her lips. His grip on the coffee cup tightened. And then, before either of them could think, he took one slow step toward her, and then another. Sophie's breath caught as he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His fingers barely touched her skin, but it felt like fire. And when he whispered, "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Sophie," she knew they were both seconds away from breaking the most important rule of all. A fire that won't die. Ethan Blackwood was a man who had built walls so high that no one had ever dared to climb them, until her. Sophie Carter had stepped into his world with her kindness, her fire, her stubborn refusal to bow to him like everyone else. And now he couldn't stop thinking about her. Couldn't stop remembering the way she had looked at him that night on the balcony, asking about his past like she actually cared. And worst of all, he wanted to tell her, but telling her meant opening a door he had locked a long time ago. So instead of answering her questions, instead of giving in to whatever this was between them, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He walked away. A game he can't control. The problem was, he couldn't walk away for long. Their fake engagement was supposed to be just that, fake. But when they returned to city, the entire world was watching. Everywhere they were, they had to play the part of the perfect couple, hand in hand at charity events, Ethan whispering in her ear during business dinners, making her shiver even when he was just pretending, dancing under chandeliers, his fingers pressing just a little too tightly against her waist. The charade was supposed to be simple, but the more they played this game, the harder it became to tell what was real and what was. The night they crossed the line, it happened at a fundraiser gala, one of those glittering high society events, where everyone smiled too much and spoke in lies. Sophie had worn a dress so stunning, so perfectly sinful, that Ethan had almost forgotten how to breathe when he saw her. She was his fiancée, and for the first time, the thought didn't feel like a lie. It felt dangerously real. The night passed in a blow of champagne, stolen glances, and whispered words. But the moment Sophie excused herself to step out onto the quiet balcony, Ethan followed, and when he found her standing there, looking out over the city lights, he knew he was losing control. "You're playing with fire, Sophie." His voice was low, rough. She turned, her eyes searching his. "Am I, or are you just afraid of getting burned?" His jaw tightened. He was afraid, but not of her. He was afraid of himself, of the things he wanted, of the way his whole world was shifting because of her. And then she reached up, her fingers brushing over the lapels of his suit, lingering just long enough to make his heart slam against his ribs. "Tell me this isn't real," she whispered. Ethan's breath hitched, his hands curled into fists at his sides, because he should say it. He should walk away, but instead, he reached for, and the second his fingers touched her skin, he was gone. A kiss that changes everything. Ethan crashed his lips against hers. A kiss that was raw, desperate, starved. Sophie gasped, but she didn't pull away. She kissed him back just as fiercely, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body pressing against his, as if she had been waiting for this, just as much as he had. He wasn't supposed to need her like this. She wasn't supposed to fit so perfectly in his arms, but she did. And when he finally pulled away, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. "We shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice rough. Sophie's fingers brushed over his jaw, a soft, achingly tender touch. "Then why do you look like you want to do it again?" Ethan let out a shaky breath, because he did, more than anything, and that terrified him. The morning after, and the walls go back up, Ethan left before Sophie would. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Last night had been a mistake, A beautiful, intoxicating, life-altering mistake. If he stayed, if he let this turn into something more, it would destroy them both. So he pulled away first. But when Sophie woke up alone, when she saw the empty space beside her, something inside her cracked. He was running.
And she was done chasing ghosts.
If Ethan Blackwood thought he could just push her away, he was wrong, because Sophie wasn't about to let him break her heart before he even had the chance to claim it. A heart left waiting. Sophie woke up to an empty bed. The warmth of Ethan's body had long faded. The only proof of last night's passionate mistake was the lingering scent of his cologne on the sheets. Her heart clenched. He had run. Again, she should have expected it. Ethan Blackwood was a man who didn't let people in. He had built an empire by controlling everything, including his emotions. But last night had been real. She had felt it in the way his hands trembled when they touched her, in the way his lips had devoured hers, as if he had been starving for something only she could give. And yet, he had left, like a coward. Sophie's fingers curled into the sheets. She was done waiting. If Ethan Blackwood thought he could run from this, from her, he had no idea who he was dealing with. A storm behind his eyes, Ethan sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, his jaw tight, his pulse still unsteady from the mistake he had made. Sophie and her soft lips, Sophie and her fierce heart, Sophie and the way she made him feel things he had buried long ago. He never should have kissed her, never should have let her get close, but he had. And now he couldn't get her out of his head. His fists clenched as he replayed the night over and over. Her whispered words, her touch, the way she had looked at him like he wasn't broken. She made him weak, and weakness was something he couldn't afford. Not when he had spent his entire life building walls to keep people out. Because love wasn't safe. Love was a weapon, a weakness that could be used against him. And Sophie Carter, she was the only person in the world who could destroy him. A confrontation that shakes the ground. Sophie wasn't waiting for him to come to her. If Ethan wanted to pretend like nothing had happened, she was going to force him to face the truth. So she stormed into his office, her heels clicking against the marble floors, ignoring the startled looks from his assistants as she pushed open the glass doors without knocking. Ethan looked up from his desk, his expression blank, too blank. Sophie saw right through it. "You're a coward." Her voice was sharp, but her eyes burned with something deeper. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Leave, Sophie." "No." She stepped closer, slamming her hands on his desk. "You don't get to run away from this. From me." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I told you this isn't real." Ethan exhaled sharply, pushing back from his chair, and standing to his full height. He towered over her, but Sophie didn't flinch. She had seen the way he had kissed her, the way he had held her like she was the only thing keeping him breathing. "Tell me, Ethan, tell me you didn't feel anything last night, and I'll walk away. I'll leave and we'll never talk about it again." Ethan's throat bobbed, his hands clenched at his sides. Sophie waited. He could end this right now. All he had to do was lie, say the words, break her heart. But the silence stretched, and when his dark eyes finally met hers, something flickered behind them, something raw, something vulnerable. He couldn't say it, because it wasn't a lie. Last night had meant something, and they both knew it. A fire that won't die. The tension between them was thick, electric. Ethan's breathing was uneven, his body rigid as if he were fighting a war inside himself. And Sophie wasn't backing down. She stepped closer. "Say it." Her voice was a whisper now, her fingers reaching for him. His entire body tensed as her hand grazed his arm. "Sophie." His voice was low, hoarse, a warning. But she ignored it, because she wasn't afraid. Because despite all of his walls, despite all of his coldness, she knew the truth. He wanted her, he felt something for her, and she was done pretending otherwise. "I'm not afraid of you, Ethan." That was all it took. Something inside him snapped. In an instant his hands were on her, gripping her waist, pulling her flush against him as his mouth crashed onto hers. This wasn't a kiss of hesitation, it was a collision. Hot, wild, desperate. Ethan's hands were everywhere, tangling in her hair, gripping her hips, pressing her against his desk, like he was afraid she'd disappear. Sophie gasped into his mouth, her fingers digging into his shirt, as the world blurred around them. They weren't pretending anymore. There was no contract, no rules, no lines left to blur. Only them, only this fire that refused to die. And when Ethan finally pulled away, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged, he whispered the words that changed everything. "You make me want things I shouldn't want, Sophie." And Sophie? She wasn't letting him run anymore, because whether he admitted it or not, he already belonged to her, a fragile happiness. For the first time in years, Ethan Blackwood allowed himself to breathe, to feel. The walls he had spent a lifetime building around his heart. Sophie had broken them effortlessly, and now, as she lay beside him in his penthouse, wrapped in his arms, her soft breaths brushing against his skin, he felt something terrifyingly close to peace. His fingers traced lazy patterns along her back, his lips pressing into her hair. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to become his weakness, but she had. And Ethan knew deep down that meant she could also become his greatest pain. The promise he shouldn't make. "What are we doing, Ethan?" Sophie whispered, her voice laced with something vulnerable. He tightened his hold on her, pressing her closer. "I don't know." And that was the truth. Because whatever this was, whatever they had become, it had blurred the lines of reality. It was no longer an act, no longer a game. She shifted in his arms, tilting her face up to him, her eyes searching his. "Are you going to push me away again?" He hated that she even had to ask. But most of all, he hated that part of him still wanted to. Because loving her meant giving her the power to hurt him. And Ethan Blackwood had sworn never to let anyone have that power over him again. No, the word was a whisper, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Sophie's lips parted in surprise, her fingers trailing over his jaw. "No." Ethan exhaled sharply, his hand moving to cup her face. "I don't want to fight this anymore." Sophie let out a breath, something shining in her eyes, hope. And when she kissed him, slow and deep, Ethan let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. That maybe for once in his life, he could have something good. Someone good, but happiness was a dangerous thing. Because the moment you believed in it, it had a way of slipping through your fingers. The beginning of the end, their happiness lasted exactly 1 week. 1 week of stolen kisses in his office. 1 week of waking up tangled in each other. 1 week of believing that love could be enough. But love wasn't a shield, and Ethan should have known. The past always finds a way to destroy the present. The betrayal, it happened at an exclusive business gala. Sophie had been glowing, her laughter lighting up the room, as she clutched a glass of champagne, standing at Ethan's side, like she belonged there. Like she belonged to him, and for a fleeting moment, he had let himself believe it. But then the whispers started. Low murmurs at first, curious glances, hushed conversations, and then someone approached. A man Ethan had barely tolerated in the business world, Richard Vaughan. He smirked as he lifted a drink to his lips. "So, Blackwood, I see you like recycling." Ethan's grip on his glass tightened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Richard's smirk deepened as he nodded towards Sophie. "You really don't know, do you?" Ethan followed his gaze. Sophie had frozen, her face pale. Richard leaned in. "Ask your little fiancé about the last billionaire she fooled." Ethan's blood ran cold. Sophie's eyes met his, wide and desperate. "Ethan, but the damage was done." The whispers grew louder, a storm of rumors crashing over them. Ethan's hands curled into fists, his body rigid with tension. "Tell me it's not true." Sophie swallowed hard, her lips parting, but no words came out, and that silence, it was enough to shatter everything. A love that breaks Ethan's world tilted. Everything, the trust, the fragile hope, the love he had barely begun to admit to himself, crumbled in an instant. His voice was quiet, but lethal. "Did you use me, Sophie?" her eyes filled with tears. No, it's not what you think, I swear. But he had already heard enough. He stepped back, his face unreadable, his heart a fury of betrayal and pain. He had let her in, he had let himself believe. And now he realized he had been a fool. I want you out of my life. The words were like a blade, cutting through her. Sophie's breath hitched, tears spilling over. Ethan, please. But he was already walking away, because loving her had been a mistake. And Ethan Blackwood didn't make the same mistake twice. A love torn apart, Sophie sat on the cold marble floor of her tiny apartment, staring at the unopened bottle of wine in front of her. Her hands trembled. Her heart felt like it had been ripped from her chest. One moment, one whisper of a past she had long buried, and Ethan had thrown her away. I want you out of my life. His words echoed like a knife slicing through her soul. She had begged him to listen, to believe in her, to fight for what they had built. But Ethan Blackwood wasn't a man who fought for love. He was a man who destroyed it before it could destroy him. A sob choked her as she curled into herself, the weight of the world crashing down on her. She had lost him, and this time, she didn't know if she would ever get him back. Drowning in the silence, Ethan sat in his penthouse, surrounded by emptiness. Whiskey burned down his throat, but it didn't burn away the image of her. Sophie, her eyes pleading, her voice breaking, her heart shattering, just like his. He had walked away from her, and yet she was everywhere. Her laugh haunted the halls of his home. Her scent lingered on his pillows. Her touch still burned on his skin. He clenched his fists. He had been a fool to let her in, a fool to believe, and now she was gone. But if that was true, why did his soul still reach for her in the dark? The truth comes too late. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan threw himself into work, into anything that would drown the ache in his chest. But then he learned the truth. It had all been a lie. The rumors, the betrayal. Sophie had never used him. She had been set up. His blood turned to ice as he stood in his office, fists clenched, his breathing ragged. He had let her go for nothing. He had broken her for nothing. And now he had to live with the fact that he had destroyed the only woman he had ever loved. But Ethan Blackwood wasn't a man who accepted defeat. If there was even the slightest chance to fix this, he would take it. Even if it meant begging her to forgive him. A love worth fighting for. Sophie didn't expect to see him again, not after the way he had ripped her apart. So when she opened the door to her apartment and found Ethan standing there, drenched in rain, she thought she was dreaming. Her breath caught, his suit was soaked, his hair a mess, his usually unreadable face full of something raw and broken. Sophie, her name was a whisper, a prayer. She gripped the door frame, her heart hammering. Why are you here? He exhaled shakily. Because I made the biggest mistake of my life. Sophie's throat tightened. And now you want to fix it. Ethan nodded, stepping closer, his eyes desperate. Tell me how. Tell me how to make this right. Tears welled in her eyes. You can't. Ethan's breath hitched. For the first time in his life, he was afraid that this time he had lost her forever. But Ethan Blackwood had never fought for anything before, until her. So if she thought he was giving up now, she didn't know just how far he was willing to go. A love that refused to die. Ethan Blackwood had spent his entire life winning. Winning in business, winning in power, winning in control. But this was the first time he had ever been terrified of losing. Sophie stood before him, arms crossed, her face unreadable. She was giving him nothing. No warmth, no forgiveness, no sign that the love that once burned between them still existed. And it killed him. Because he knew, he had done this. He had let his own demons destroy what was real. What if he was too late? The fight for redemption. Sophie had built herself back up. She had learned how to stand without him. And now Ethan was standing in front of her, asking for something she wasn't sure she could give. Trust, love, a second chance. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You broke me, Ethan. Pain flashed in his eyes. I know. You walked away without even hearing me out. He swallowed hard. I was a coward. His honesty took her breath away. This wasn't the Ethan she had fallen in love with. This was a man who had been broken too. But that didn't erase the pain. How do I know you won't do it again? She asked. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze burning into hers. Because I've never fought for anything in my life, Sophie. Until you. A shiver ran through her. Tell me what to do, he murmured. Tell me how to prove it to you. Her heart ached. Because part of her wanted to run. But the other still loved him. A grand gesture, that changed everything. Sophie wasn't ready to let him back in. So Ethan did the only thing he could. He fought, not with words, but with actions. Every day he showed up, at her coffee shop, waiting outside before she opened, leaving flowers at her doorstep without a note, volunteering at the homeless shelter, the very place she had once been. And slowly, painfully, the cracks in her walls started to show. But the moment that changed everything, the night Ethan stood in front of the entire world and bared his soul, the public confession, at a high-profile charity gala, with reporters and cameras flashing, Ethan took the stage. The crowd fell silent, and then he spoke. I built my life, believing love was a weakness. I was wrong. The room held its breath. Sophie, standing at the back, felt her heart stop. Ethan's voice was raw. I walked away from the only woman who ever made me feel alive. And I've regretted it every second since. Gasps echoed through the crowd. But Ethan, he only looked at Sophie. I love you, Sophie, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it if you let me. A tear slipped down her cheek. Because this wasn't just words. This was everything. The walls she had so carefully rebuilt came crashing down. And suddenly she was moving, running, straight into his arms. The moment their lips met, the crowd erupted into applause. But Sophie and Ethan heard nothing. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. A love that was finally free. Ethan held her like she was his world. Because she was. He whispered against her lips, I'll never let you go again. And Sophie believed him. Because this time their love was strong enough to survive anything. Even fate itself. A love worth protecting. Sophie had never felt this kind of happiness before. Not the fleeting, fragile kind, but the kind that felt like home. Ethan kept his promise. Every morning he woke up beside her, holding her as if he feared she might disappear. Every night he whispered, I love you, like a vow. She had never doubted him again. Until the past came knocking. A shadow from the past. It started with a phone call. A number Sophie hadn't seen in years. Her hands trembled as she picked up. Hello, silence, and then Sophie. It's me. Her blood turned to ice. Him, the man who had once ruined her life. The man who had dragged her name through the mud, spread the lies that had nearly destroyed her. And now he was back. I know where you are. His voice was smooth, smug, and I know about Ethan Blackwood. Sophie's breath hitched. What do you want? A low chuckle. Oh, sweetheart. I just want to talk. Unless, of course, you want Ethan to find out the one thing you never told him. Her heart pounded. Because she knew exactly what he was talking about. A secret she never wanted to reveal. Sophie had told Ethan everything. Everything except this. Because this could ruin everything. She sat on the edge of their bed that night, staring at Ethan as he read through work files, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. How could she tell him? Would he forgive her for keeping this from him? Would he still love her after he knew the truth? Sophie closed her eyes. There was only one way to find out. She had to tell him. Because if she didn't, the past would destroy them all over again. The truth comes out. Sophie stood in front of Ethan, her hands clenched, her heart racing. I need to tell you something. Ethan frowned. immediately alert. What is it? She hesitated, and that hesitation set off something dark in his eyes. Sophie, his voice was softer now.
Oh, whatever it is.
Tell me. So she did. She told him everything. About her past. About the man who had once controlled her life. About the lie that had followed her for years. She expected anger. She expected betrayal. But what she got was love. Ethan cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she didn't even realize had fallen. You think this changes anything? He murmured. Sophie swallowed hard. Doesn't it? Ethan's jaw tensed. The only thing this changes is how much harder I'll fight to protect you. A sob broke from her lips, and then he was kissing her. Fiercely, desperately. Like he was proving something, that no matter what came next, he wasn't letting go. A future they chose together. The past had tried to break them. Doubt had almost destroyed them. But in the end love had won. And as Ethan slipped a ring onto Sophie's finger, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, she knew this wasn't just the end of their story. It was only the beginning. 1 year later, the sun painted golden hues across the sky as the waves kissed the shore. Sophie stood barefoot on the soft white sand, her wedding dress flowing around her. Behind her, guests laughed and talked, celebrating a love that had survived every storm. And in front of her, Ethan Blackwood, her husband, her forever. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers, his grip warm and steady. You're finally mine. Sophie smiled, heart full. I was always yours. A love worth fighting for. The past didn't define them anymore. They had faced it together. They had won. Now, their future was theirs to write. As Ethan pulled her into his arms for their first dance, as husband and wife, Sophie knew, no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because their love wasn't just a moment. It was forever. A little surprise. Weeks after the wedding, Ethan walked into their bedroom to find Sophie sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at something in her hands. A small white stick. Her hands trembled as she looked up at him. Ethan, I think I'm pregnant. Silence. Then a slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face. He knelt in front of her, pressing his forehead to her stomach. You just gave me the greatest gift in the world. Tears filled her eyes. You're happy? Ethan looked up at her, his gaze full of nothing but love. I've never been happier. And as he kissed her, whispering promises of forever, Sophie knew their love story had only just begun. Daddy Blackwood in full mode. 2 years later, Ethan Blackwood, the ruthless billionaire, the man feared in boardrooms worldwide, was currently pacing the nursery like a madman. His daughter Lily Blackwood had just taken her first wobbly steps, and now she was an unstoppable force of chaos. Sophie, he called out, voice edged with concern. Are you sure we shouldn't put extra padding on the walls? Or maybe hire security? What if she falls? Sophie, watching from the doorway, folded her arms, trying not to laugh. Ethan, she's a toddler, not a high-profile investment. Ethan turned, eyes sharp. She's my daughter. That makes her the most valuable thing in the world. Sophie rolled her eyes. She has to learn, babe. Ethan scowled. Fine, but I'm staying within 5 feet of her at all times. Sophie sighed. Ethan, but before she could finish, Lily giggled and took off running, right toward the coffee table. Ethan lunged like a trained bodyguard, scooping her up mid-air. His heartbeat was outrageously fast. He exhaled sharply, holding her close. That was too close. Lily giggled and grabbed his face with her tiny hands. Dada. Ethan melted. Sophie shook her head. You're ridiculous. Ethan kissed Lily's forehead, and then looked at Sophie, completely serious. We're bubble wrapping the whole house. Sophie groaned. Oh my God. Lily just laughed, because even at her tiny age, She already knew she had her daddy wrapped around her little finger. The overprotective dad vows begin. Later that night, as Lily slept peacefully in her crib, Ethan held Sophie close, whispering into her hair, "I love you both more than anything." Sophie smiled, "Even more than your billion-dollar empire." Ethan smirked, "That empire means nothing without my girls." And Sophie knew, without a doubt, Ethan Blackwood, the once untouchable billionaire, had finally found his true purpose: being a husband, being a father, and most importantly, being the man who would love and protect his family, always.